Ladies and gentlemen, dear sirs and madam, welcome. This is Human Faces of Climate Change, Science in Practice for Just Transition conference organized by National Center for Climate Change, a part of the Institute of Environmental Protection National Research Institute. My name is Magdalena Petryniak, and I will have a pleasure of being the host and moderator of today's event. And what's going to happen today? Today we are going to talk about the role of contemporary science in search for practical solutions in order to mitigate and stop anthropogenic climate change. In order to make the scientific tools effective, we need to involve society not just in the implementation phase, but actually much earlier in the stage of elaborating and co-creating such solutions. For that to happen, scientists need to leave their offices and laboratories and go out into the world. Today we are bringing together scientists, opinion leaders, experts on climate change for all around the globe to discuss and share best practices on climate change and just transition. But before we start these fruitful discussions, I would like to invite you to listen to a message that we received from Mr. Michał Kurtyka, President of COP24 and former Minister of Climate and Environment of Poland.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm so happy to be able to welcome you at the next session of our Human Faces of the Climate Change conference. This time we are going to look with the eyes of ordinary people, everybody, like workers, taxpayers, consumers, children, women in poor, rich country, employed or unemployed. We want to look at the phenomenon of just transition and make sure that we understand what does it mean and how can we use science in order to properly address challenges linked with the just transition. After COP26, after the completion of the Katowice rulebook, which happened in Glasgow, we right now have a legislative framework for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So right now, it is of extreme importance to be able to see how an effective implementation of climate policy can happen. And this implementation will not be possible if we do not look at challenges from the perspective of ordinary people. It will not happen if we leave somebody behind. It requires then time, it requires energy, it requires resources, it requires first and above all understanding and awareness. This is what Human Faces of the Climate Change conference is about. And I welcome you very much. I wish you a great discussion, and I hope that together we can make sure that just transition is really taking place. Thank you very much. Good day.
Thank you, Mr. Kurtyka. And now it's time to introduce the program of today's conference. Today we have gathered renowned experts on climate change, and each of our experts will address three fundamental aspects of bringing science into the process of just transition. Each of our experts will answer three questions that we prepared for the conference. The first one will be about how to translate theory into practice while providing scientific solutions to problems of real people. Secondly, we will discuss how to match, how to connect science and society, especially when we are looking for answers to the just transition processes. And finally, the question about the dialogue. is the social dialogue future of of science? How can we find models and mechanisms to create the dialogue between scientists and society and decision makers? We will be talking about the language and also involving spiritual and intellectual leaders in green transition. Those are the key topics we will tackle today. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers and experts in the first panel of the conference. I'm super happy to introduce our distinguished guests, who are Professor Jim Ski, co-chair Working Group 3, Mitigation of Climate Change, IPCC. Hello.
Hello.
We will also have Professor Katarzyna Jasikowska from the Institute of Sociology, Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Good morning. Together with us is Professor Andreas Loschel, Professor of Environmental Resource Economy and Sustainability from the Ruhr-Universität Bochum, and Professor Faba Konduri, President-elect of the European Association of Environmental and Natural Resource Economists. This is the first panel of experts, and I would like to give the floor first to Professor Jim Ski from IPCC and ask for your presentation on these three emerging topics of the conference.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to actually speak at this event. I do have some PowerPoint slides, so if the organisers could put these up, I would be happy to speak to these. Now, just to say, in terms of the three questions, I'm going to address them very indirectly in my presentation, because frankly I have not done very much scientific work, as it were, on just transition. All of the work I have done has been of a practical nature. And if I might comment on the first question about translating theory into practice, I think this is actually one of the many areas in which practice has preceded theory, and the role of theory then becomes to understand the processes better, fine-tune it, and systematize the thinking about it. Because just transition ideas have now been around for quite a long time, and perhaps the academics have come to it a little bit later and are trying to make more sense of what is going on. So what I am going to do, I have been chairing a Just Transition Commission in Scotland, which is where I come from. And what I'd like to do, quite simply, is just explain what happened there and then touch indirectly on the three questions that the organisers have set up. So if we could move to the next slide, please. This is giving you an indication of what it was, the Just Transition Commission. It actually started by a collaboration between the Scottish Trades Union Congress and Friends of the Earth Scotland, recognising that they had some practical problems to deal with each other. So as a result of their persuasion, the Scottish Government at the end of 2018 set up this commission to provide it with practical, realistic and affordable recommendations that would help Scottish ministers think about the kind of the social and economic aspects of a transition to the net zero carbon economy by 2045, which is the legislated goal in Scotland, build on the existing economic strengths and assets, but then also understand very carefully the kind of risks that we face as we move through that transition towards net zero. So it was a request for practical kind of things. Now, if we could just move it on one more slide, and if I can get what the makeup of the commission was. There certainly were academics in there. There was myself chairing it, and I had colleagues from the universities of Strathclyde and Heriot-Watt, which are based in Glasgow and Edinburgh, respectively. But the other members came from the trade union movement with 2 members, WWF Scotland, a community energy action group, Energy Action Scotland, and a number of people from the private sector, an industrial consultancy very concerned with hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, SSE, which is a big utility, and the Oil and Gas Technology Centre. And I would flag that a lot of Scotland's economy has been dependent on offshore oil and gas from the North Sea, which is a particular challenge at the moment. We had another group from the 2050 Climate Group, which is a younger set of people concerned with the climate change turnover. And because of the importance of agriculture and land use issues, we had a member from Quality Meat Scotland as well. So this was a stakeholder group rather than an academic group, but with a suitable amount of academic input sitting alongside the people from the other constituencies. Now, if we could move it on, I think the question of how we operated was also quite important. During 2019, before we were effectively closed down by COVID and had to operate by Zoom, what we did for every meeting, we didn't meet in Edinburgh or Glasgow, the kind of the urban centres. We moved around Scotland. So in the top left-hand corner, we had a first meeting at the Coalfield Regeneration Trust, which is based in one of the areas where Scotland once had a coal industry, which is run down. And I would flag that Scotland has now left coal behind it. Our last coal-fired power station closed in 2016. So one of the things we're interested in there is looking at backwards and seeing how these transitions were managed. Bottom left-hand corner, we were talking with farmers in a rural part of Scotland about some of the challenges that they face. Bottom in the middle, we were meeting with people working in the oil and gas sector at the Oil and Gas Technology Centre in Aberdeen. And actually in the top right-hand corner, we were actually visiting the petrochemicals complex, but it's not very photogenic. So we took this example of economic diversification into tourism, which the area had gone into. So the key message is that we were trying to get out. We had meetings with stakeholders in each area, and the day before each meeting, we went on site visits, and the evening before we ran town hall kind of meetings to talk to people about their concerns. Now, if we move it on again one more time, please. We actually produced 3 reports in the 2 years of our existence. Our final report was in March 2021, this year. So we produced an interim report about a year in that set out our initial thinking. And then about 18 months in, the Scottish Government asked us for a report on a green recovery from COVID and how that tied into the Just Transition agenda. And that report was produced in very, very short order. And then the final report came out in March this year, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So if we can move it on into our earlier thinking, this is the closest I think we came to theory, I think, in the approach. This was the guiding principle that we used to guide us. So the imperative of a just transition is that policies are designed in a way that ensures that the benefits of climate change action, and there are benefits, are shared widely, while the costs don't unfairly burden particular groups of people. And to pick up on my first remark about practice coming before theory, we didn't start with this remark. The civil servant who was drafting the report put this in about, footnote 3 on page 26, and all members of the commission decided this was such a good quote, we elevated it right to the front because we thought it captured and set out the thinking that we had. So if we can move on one more slide again on just what the scope of what we meant by just transition. And we do understand that in many countries, and I can think Poland is one of these as well, the primary issue has been about getting how you, in a dignified way that doesn't disadvantage people, get out of the coal industry. But that's behind us in Scotland. So we now have to think about really tough issues, right? What happens with the oil and gas sector? But we also wanted to think more broadly, not just about the supply side of the economy, but the impacts of the transition on consumers, on the importance of communities and the importance of place. And Scotland, like every other country in the world, has existing injustices. And we were concerned that what we came up with could also start to address these past injustices as well. And we particularly picked out issues around land tenure in the rural sector, fair work, knowing that delivering pizzas and working at the Amazon Regional Centre is not necessarily the best quality kind of work, and energy poverty as issues that needed to be addressed. So if we can move it on again, one more slide, I'll move quite quickly given the time we've got. So with the Green Recovery Report that came out just about 18 months ago, I mean, it gives you a signal for what we thought were some of the main priorities in Scotland at the time. So the first one is investment in warmer homes, and anybody who stayed in Glasgow for COP26 in a smaller hotel somewhere may have noticed the lack of good insulation on many properties. So a big programme on investing in warmer homes and other buildings, which brings triple benefits because it reduces emissions, reduces energy poverty, and it also provides a lot of employment for people doing deeper retrofits of buildings. A second one was related to a concern about the time of COVID, about a lack of trust in public transport. So we had a lot of recommendations about maintaining faith in public transport systems, and also helping Scotland to build, because it's actually a lot of hydrogen fuel cell and electric buses are built in Scotland, and that was an issue as well. And then the final and very big one, this is probably the biggest political issue, is what happens with the oil and gas sector. So we had recommendations about speeding up decommissioning of the North Sea facilities and repurposing it for low carbon, which has a lot of potential benefits. But there are also many other ways in which the skills of the oil and gas industry can be redeployed in offshore renewables, hydrogen production, carbon capture and storage. All of these skills work somewhere else. So then turning, just towards the end, to the final recommendations that we made. If we could have the next slide, please. We made 24 recommendations to government overall, which we deliberately designed to be realistic and practical, as the ministers actually asked for. And because 24 is too many to present, we divided these into 4 broad themes. And the first theme was about the importance of planning in taking things forward, because the lessons we learned from the exit from coal in the UK in the 1980s and 1990s, it was an unplanned and was a manifestly unjust transition. So unplanned transitions tend to be unjust. So it's very important that planning is there. So we made recommendations about having just transition sector plans for each part of the economy. So that was a very important part of it. The second part was about the skills agenda, making sure people had retraining in the middle of their careers, and in fact there was a good base in early years education for the kind of economy which would be net zero. And there are a number of very specific things that are very specific to Scotland that we picked up there. And there is, in fact, now a climate emergency skills action plan and appropriate funding to sort of move that on. And if we could move to the next slide, the third part was empowering and invigorating communities, because most people do experience climate change and other environmental action at the local level. And we had a host of recommendations about the way that community groups conducted themselves, and indeed the way that local authorities can construct their budgets around climate change in a more inclusive and consultative kind of way. And I would flag that, as well as the Just Transition Commission, there was also a parallel citizens' assembly running in Scotland, which came up with many recommendations that came bottom up from people, but really actually had a strong set of synergies with what we ended up recommending here. And the final one is about sharing the benefits widely and ensuring the burdens are distributed on the basis of ability to pay. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what that means. So, for example, most of the cost of decarbonisation in Scotland and the UK so far has been borne by electricity consumers. It's loaded on electricity bills. And that is manifestly not fair, in terms of people who have no choice but to use electricity for heating their homes. In comparison with standard taxation, it's very regressive in its impact. So that's one example. Another example is how we deal with the electrification of transport, because electric vehicles will be coming in, and how that affects people in rural communities who may have less access to charging infrastructure. So these are the kind of issues that we're thinking about there. Now, did it end up anywhere? Next slide, please. I think the answer is yes, it actually did. because the Scottish government, there was a new government elected back in May, and as soon as it came in, it accepted all of our recommendations without exception, which made us all wish that we'd been more ambitious and asked for even more. But the biggest one was perhaps what we now do have is a special minister for just transition, employment and fair work, which as far as we know is a world first in terms of a ministerial portfolio. We have an overall just transition planning framework under which will set a set of sectoral just transition plans. And the first sectoral plan will be about the energy sector, and that's already in preparation. And that will cover things like the exit from oil and gas, the movement to renewable energy and energy efficiency. And on the skills side, we do have that climate emergency skills action plan, a green jobs workforce academy, and a green jobs fund to help with skills and training. And just to say, we've identified many barriers to actually people making that movement. A diver on a North Sea oil and gas platform needs to spend about €2,000 on retraining in order to do pretty much the same job on an offshore wind platform. And these are the kind of examples of reducing these barriers to smooth the pathways to new employment in labour markets. And just, I think the final slide, which I've got here, which is just coming up, next slide please, is that there will be a new, in fact, there is a new Just Transition Commission, and the Scottish ministers again asked me to chair this in the second phase, and it's much more about implementation. The jobs will be to scrutinise and provide advice on all of the sectoral just transition plans, to help develop indicators for monitoring and evaluating progress towards just transition, and continue with the practices we had in the first phase of engaging very, very strongly with people in communities. And we will be producing an annual report every year to make that all very transparent. So that's about the end of my presentation. If I can briefly turn to the three questions, I hope I have demonstrated that theory and practice link with each other. Though for me, I think I have to say also with my IPCC hat on, I start from the policymakers' end of the telescope and ask how scientists can make themselves useful for the policy process. And I should just hope that I've emphasised there that social dialogue, which was very evident from this, is indeed the key to the future. And that's the way that science needs to engage with the policy process. And I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor. You absolutely did a great job addressing all three questions, and thank you so much for sharing these practical examples, how you are collaborating with the local governments, communities, and the process that is going on in Scotland. All the recommendations are very, very important. Thank you so much for your presentation, and now it's time to welcome Professor Faba Konduri, President-elect of the European Association of Environmental and Natural Resource Economists. Professor Konduri, I'm very happy to meet you again, and I hope that this conference will be another opportunity to share your extensive knowledge and practice. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and be able to communicate how we work on the science policy interface. What we do is quite similar to what has been described by Professor Sekia before. And let me start by saying very quickly that we work as a cluster of sustainability transition. This is a cluster of research institutions that I direct and works on the different pathways for supporting the sustainability transition. This includes the Research Laboratory on Socioeconomic and Environmental Sustainability at the Athens University of Economics and Business, where my chair is. The Athena Research and Innovation Center, which is the biggest center in the country on information technology, research and innovation. There we try to develop the green and digital transition pathways within the Sustainable Development Unit that I direct. I also direct the Greek hub of the public-private partnership, the European public-private partnership of the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, which is called Climate Kick, and it finances and incubates innovative companies that are focused on technologies, but also social innovations that are relevant for the transition to a climate neutral economy. And then we work a lot with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network under the auspices of the General Secretary of the United Nations. I lead the European and Greek hub. And this is the biggest network in the world of university and institutions that try to communicate science results, research and innovation results that are relevant for the sustainability transition and to the stakeholders that will implement them. So it's exactly about the science policy stakeholder interface. Who is supposed to implement the transition? Well, the politicians, the policymakers, the businesses, the financial institutions, the civil society as a whole. Next slide, please. So we work on research and innovation projects, innovation acceleration and deep demonstration. It is important to showcase the ability of an innovation to help a local community, a regional authority, a national authority in the transition pathway, in implementing the transition pathway. And of course, a big part of the implementation is not just working with the stakeholders in terms of co-designing the pathways, but it is about upskilling, reskilling, educating the stakeholders in order to have the capacity to engage in this transition. The transition is basically driven by technological advancements. Finances are important, policy making is important, but the transition is made possible because technological advancements are offering cost-effective alternatives to fossil fuels. So these technological advancements need to be communicated, they need to be understood, and they need to by the stakeholders, and the stakeholders need to have the skills and knowledge to use these technological advancements. And it's a big challenge of our times during the fourth industrial revolution, where we have an unprecedented pace of technological advancements. It's a big challenge where the labor force is able, even universities are able to keep up the pace of upskilling, reskilling, and communicating new knowledge and capabilities to the current and future labor force in terms of university graduates and so on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So at the moment that we are speaking, we are facing a multiple crisis. Of course, the pandemic, the huge recession that derives from it, climate change crisis, the increased frequency, severity of extreme weather events that is caused by the increase in average temperature of the planet, which is in turn caused by greenhouse gas emissions, mainly CO2 and methane. And then the biodiversity collapse, the collapse of the ecosystem services on which our economy and society depends on. So we are working on systemic, holistic, integrated, and interdisciplinary solutions that include at all the different phases of the solution design and pathway, the engagement of the stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders, because it's important to address these multiple crises in a systemic and integrated way, and we need to do it fast. And we know from the pandemic experience that the world is as resilient as the last country and person in it. And we also know that the way to solve huge challenges and huge transformational challenges, which is what we are called to do today, is through education. Is the most powerful weapon with which you can use to change the world, as it has already been said before me. Next slide, please. So what do we have in terms of policymaking? In terms of policymaking, we have the SDGs. It has been signed in 2015, New York, 193 countries. This is the only other agenda, the only other global agenda in addition to the UN Charter for Human Rights. We have the Paris Agreement, an agreement to try to keep the temperature of the increase in the average temperature of the planet below 1.5 degrees. We now know that we can only afford 1.5 degrees increase in the global temperature. Then we have the recognition that the SDGs are really a very holistic framework, and no SDG can be fully implemented without the others being implemented. And this is what the first 2019 announcement was, a Climate Week, again, New York. We presented at UNSDSN the 6 pathways that can operationalize the SDGs. And this referred to well-being and health, sustainable cities and communities, sustainable use, production of food and sustainable use of water, seas and oceans, sustainable industry and decarbonization, and of course the digital revolution to sustainable development. By the end of 2019, Europe shows its leadership in this green and digital transition pathway by announcing the European Green Deal with 4 main access: climate neutrality by 2050, reduction of pollution, clean tech leadership of European companies, and of course, leave no one behind. A transition that will engage all of the citizens, a transition that will support the cohesion of the society. And of course, the European Green Deal is supported by 1 trillion, some of it coming from the EU budget and some of it coming from hope to be leveraged from public-private partnership. Unfortunately, early 2020, we have the coronavirus, many short-run responses to the coronavirus, but of course, the main serious response, the medium-run response, Next Generation EU, which includes the Recovery and Resilience Fund, 750 billion in addition to the multi-annual financial framework of Europe to be invested in the green and digital transition. All investments in the Next Generation EU need to be 37% climate mainstream and 20% digital mainstream. And this year we have the climate law, first time that we have a law that supports the implementation, that commits the member states to the implementation of 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. We have the EU taxonomy, which basically tries to streamline capital to sustainable investments, which are explicitly identified investments in climate adaptation, mitigation, biodiversity protection, circular economy, a sustainable use of water and marine resources. And together with the EU taxonomy, we have the Sustainability Corporate Directive that makes very explicit the requirements for sustainability reports. it assesses the information that is included there. It digitally tags the information that is included there, and also creates sustainability requirements for asset management. This is very important because we are mobilizing through policy, we are transforming in a way the financial sector. We engage the financial sector in this transformation for identifying and financing the sustainable investments, and at the same time, we engage them in a responsibility to report their sustainable actions in a very specific format that will be monitored. So trying to avoid greenwashing, and at the same time, we try to do that for their clients, the companies. So it's a form of engagement that needs to, again, invest in upskilling and reskilling the financial institutions, the entrepreneurs, in order to have the capacity to really engage in this transformation. Then we have the Fit for 55 package. These are 13 legislative proposals that are revising everything that has to do with climate laws in Europe, changing the Energy Efficiency Directive, the directive that manages the land use system, the directive that manages anything that has to do with mobility, fuels, cars, vans, aviation, maritime, and in addition, the emissions trading system, and at the same time creating a social facility, a social fund to support those that are going to be regressively affected by all this climate law. So we have, in terms of stakeholder engagement, explicit in the European Green Deal, the Just Transition Fund, more than 100 billion that is going to be devoted to areas that are disproportionately affected by decarbonization. We have the Next Generation EU that again allows investments in these areas that are extremely vulnerable in this transition. And we also had the Fit for 55 with an explicit fund to finance those that are going to be regressively affected by the transition. Please go on. So at the moment, we have a situation where we have a huge momentum for commitment to climate neutrality. After the COP, we have 40 countries committing to 2050 climate neutrality, China 2060, India 2070. This was the best COP of my life, not because of all these pledges, which were unprecedented before, even though we are not happy that China and India are talking beyond 2050 for their climate neutrality, but at least they are on the map now. The US and China will continue climate negotiations. What made me especially optimistic is the fact that I see businesses and financial institutions really engage. 130 trillion worth of business and financial institutions vote to put climate at the heart of finance. And at the same time, we have the agreement to develop a global standard body to avoid greenwashing, and then we have pledges with regards to methane reduction, with regards to forests, stopping deforestation and conserving forests, which is huge because they are major sinks for CO2 emissions. We have the refinement of the integrity of the carbon market, and of course we have the big issue of how we are going to engage in this transition, not only Europe and the developed world, but also the less developed countries. How are we going to create the fiscal space for them, which they don't have? And how are we going to transfer technology to these countries in order to engage them in the transition? For the not just for their welfare, which is important, but for the overall geopolitical stability of the world. We cannot solve these problems just Europe and just the developed world. We need to have holistic solutions for everybody, so we need to care about their engagement. Next slide, please. So this is how it looks now. The real world action based on current policies will get us to plus 2.7 degrees Celsius. The best case scenarios, if we're counting all the nationally determined contributions, all the long-term strategies, including all the pledges for 2050, will get us to 1.8. It's not bad, but the point is we need implementation. Next slide, please. And in order to implement something, it's not enough to have policies. It's not enough to have the science. It's not enough to have the technologies developed and accelerated with high technological readiness level. It's not even enough to have the financial means to do it and the financial instruments to incentivize it. You need to engage all the society, all the stakeholders. And this need is even bigger when you have to move fast. We cannot continue to work with gradual incremental changes. It will not be enough. We need to achieve these goals fast. So in order to really engage in a fundamental transition of the economic, social, and financial systems and trigger exponential change in decarbonization rates, in conserving biodiversity, and in doing so in a way that produces positive economic multipliers and produces new jobs, we need to transform our economy. Next slide, please. We need to transform our society, and we need to engage all the stakeholders in this transformation. And the way we do it is through systems innovation approach. Systems innovation can be understood as a combination of systems thinking and the process of innovation, so as to enable transformative change within complex systems. And this is exactly what we try to do in all of our projects. The last 10 years, we received competitive funding in our cluster of more than 500 million for exactly engaging in interdisciplinary projects that are guided through systems innovation approach. Next slide, please. So what we do here is that we start from the present and we co-design with all our relevant stakeholders, the politicians, the policymakers, the businesses, the financial institutions, the NGOs, the civil society, and of course the scientists and the technology developers, the vision, the future vision. We agree on where we want to be by 2030, by 2050, and then we backstage and we develop in detail the technological mixture, the financial pathways and the policy pathways that will support the transition. Next slide, please. So this is the approach we use, and our results are reported every year in the annual report of SDSN Europe on the transformations for the joint implementation of SDGs and the European Green Deal that I co-lead with Jeff Sachs. Next slide, please. In this report, we develop through the systems innovation approach, very specific, country-specific for all European countries, technological and investment pathways for the transition. And within this, we identify the right mixture of renewable, circular economy, nature-based solutions, climate adaptation projects, and digitalization that will pave the way towards sustainability. Next slide, please. it is important to conceive the implementation of the European Green Deal in a systemic approach, simultaneously addressing multiple objectives and policy instruments and technological solutions. And it is important to focus on the hard-to-abate sectors, cements, iron, petrochemicals. It is important to identify the cost-effective mix of renewables, focus on transport, again, a very difficult sector on railways and motorways and airways and navigation, and of course, focus on buildings, retrofitting buildings and new guidelines for new buildings. Next slide, please. And it is not just the energy system, it's the land use system as well. So through the SDSN, we work with Faba consortium that engages in identifying the pathways for the transition in the land use system as well. And the two systems are there, considered together. Next slide, please. And what is driving the whole thing, as I said before, is innovation. And the good news here is that India and China are leaders in these technological innovations that we need for the transition. And this is a big hope for the globe because it creates a huge incentive for them to engage in the transition. Next slide, please. And in order to support this innovation, we need sustainable patient finance. Next slide, please. The sustainable finance need to integrate the value of nature, needs to monetize the value of nature and integrate it in cost-benefit analysis for identifying the correct allocation of resources. So we have natural capital, we have human capital, we have man-made capital, and we should be able to take all these forms of capitals into account when we are allocating resources to different investments. Next slide, please. And the other big step that we need to do and we are working on is reconceptualizing the missions of our financial sector in order to give the ability to governments to play an entrepreneurial role to provide patient long-term strategic finance that will support sustainable innovation. So at the macro level, we need to reconceptualize financial stability and the missions of central banks to include climate and environmental risk. At the meso level, we need national public investment organizations to provide positive sources of long-term patient finance. And at the micro level, we need to convince the companies and give them capacity to engage in sustainable practices and engage with innovation so that they become the ones that will be successful in the future. Next slide, please. Next slide. So it is important to do all this, but at the same time, not engage everybody and make sure that we support the cohesion of the society. And the cohesion of the society, next slide, please, it will be supported by creating jobs. Please click to eyes. And we know that the European Green Deal increases jobs by almost 1 million in the energy and energy-related sector, and additional jobs in other sectors. So jobs will be created. Next slide, please, and I will be finishing in half a minute. Next slide, please. Next. And although new jobs will be created and new fiscal space is created through the EU Next Generation, at least in Europe, we know that climate policies will have regressive effects on the vulnerable, some vulnerable groups, but we simulated in a general equilibrium analysis how these regressive effects can be mitigated. And actually we showed that it's a package of measures of redistributing the climate taxes revenues through lump sum transfers, through targeted energy efficiency measures, through job retraining programs, through funding of subsidies for new low carbon technologies via general taxation. Next slide. We can actually achieve the implementation of the climate laws, and at the same time, we can ensure more equality, increased GDP and employment. Next slide, please. So all is possible, but we really need to engage all the stakeholders in this transition, and engagement really means upskilling and reskilling. This is the Sustainable Development Report that we produce every year as UN, as DSN. Next slide, please. And what is important to see here, next slide, is the performance of each and every country with regards to each and every SDG. And this is the performance with regards to education for sustainable development. And we see that we have a lot to do in order to really have the ability as a population to engage in this sustainability transition. Green means a goal achieved, red means we face huge challenges, and yellow and orange, we still have a lot of challenges to deal with. So the important message from this is educate, upskill, reskill the stakeholders in order to engage in the co-design of the technological, policy, and financial transition pathways. And through this systems approach, we can reinvent our economic, social, and financial systems in a way that we accelerate the transformational change that we need in order to save, in order to support our welfare on this planet. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation, showcasing all the mechanisms that can be used in the process of just transition, and particularly emphasizing the technological investments in just transition, which actually the science plays a key role. Thank you so much, Professor Konduri. And now I'd like to invite to the table Professor Katarzyna Jasikowska from the University in Krakow, Jagiellonian University. Hello, Professor. Professor, I have a question. In your current role, you focus on the role of education in increasing the awareness of climate change. I would like to ask you, where do you see the biggest challenges in convincing people that just transition will have an impact on their everyday lives, but actually also have and will create opportunities for people?
Okay, I think I will answer that question during my presentation. So if you allowed, I will continue with the presentation, and then I will go back to this question.
Please do, of course.
Okay, so to start with, I would like to introduce myself a little bit. And this is not only for my ego, but it is a key element of my presentation. And I would like to, before I start, I would like to say that I totally agree with the person who was presenting before me, that engagement is the key factor of just transition. And my today's presentation will be in 90% about the engagement. So my name is Katarzyna Jasikowska, and I work at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, which is a Polish university, one of the oldest in Europe, at which about 40,000 students, we have about 40,000 students and about 9,000 people employed, which means that it is quite a big institution and the biggest employer in the region. And I'm particularly interested in globalization, in global education, and at the core of global education nowadays is, of course, climate education. Needless to say, this is my topic number one. And the very final thing about myself, the most important one, which comes to this presentation, which is really connected with the entire presentation, is that I am very close with the bottom-up initiative, grassroots students initiative called Klimatuj. And this is a very special initiative which arose 2.5 years ago, and which gathers people who do not agree to further downplay the seriousness of climate and ecological crisis, and who build academic social movement and work for climate justice. So this is the very short characteristic of this grassroots movement. And I would like to emphasize that I am a sociologist, a professor at that university, and therefore I will have a little presentation entitled A Sociologist in Practice for Just Intergenerational Transition. So this word intergenerational transition is very crucial for me, because in my everyday work, I work with students who are more or less in their 20s. And these are people who will have to face all the actions we take, or actions not taken by my generation and older ones in the foreseeable future. So my presentation actually has only 3 points. The first one is petition to have a climate strategy at the university. The second point is interdisciplinary course. And the third one is the results of the engagement of the Klimatui initiative. So let me move on to the first point of my presentation, which is the petition. And I would like to emphasize that everything started from a bunch of frustrated young people who were convinced that the university is not doing enough in face of climate and ecological crisis, and shared this frustration also with me. So people started to work and think what can be done. And this tiny initiative and engagement, I would like to emphasize that engagement of a few people started a process of participatory discussions around future climate strategy for the entire university. And this process was it was a dialogue, of course, but it was even more than that. It was a participatory dialogue to which everyone was invited. And I just to give you a hint how it looked like, it wasn't a, let's say, conversation of a bunch of people for 3 hours, but it was a process that took a year, and many people go through it, people from different walks of life, from different backgrounds, different values. But finally, there was a document produced and delivered to the rector of the Jagiellonian University, who was happy to meet a delegation of Klimatui in May in previous academic year. And what was in the document, I will not elaborate on that. If anyone interested, I may send you English version of it, but what vision of academia emerges from that process and from that experience. So the first of all, university is responsible, should take responsibility for climate ecological crisis in a very systemic approach. In other words, being a responsible student, being a responsible consumer, being a responsible citizen is not enough. Systemic changes are required, and these systemic changes can be done by politicians, by institutions, and by organizations. And the institution students can address in their nearest surrounding, the biggest one and the most powerful one is the university. There is, of course, the theme of carbon neutrality, just transition, of course, social diversity, taking actions for social change, and of course, and on the top of that, democratic and community values that should be recognized at every stage of this process and implementation of the climate strategy. So this is just a few words about the very petition that was accepted. And in the meantime, people who gathered around working on this document decided, by people, I mean students who were involved in that, decided that this is very important to have a special course at the university that addresses this issue. And I'm not saying that we don't have courses on climate change, on ecological crisis, on Anthropocene, talking broadly about the entire bunch of things related with one another and overcoming of planetary boundaries, but the special course that would be interdisciplinary. And I was lucky enough to be there, and I decided to coordinate that with the very, very strong support of my students who were active in this bottom-up initiative. And we designed a course entitled Challenges for the Democracy in Climate Ecological Crisis Era, Interdisciplinary Approach. What does it mean in practice? In practice, it meant that I had to approach many colleagues from different departments, people working at the university, but also experts, artists, non-governmental workers outside the university, and invite them to the course. And we managed to do that. Even more, also students from different departments participated in that course. So altogether, I had colleagues collaborating with me who are biologists, climatologists, lawyers, psychologists, economists, person interested in neurobiology, of course, sociology, activists outside the academia. And last year, because this course will be organized for the third time this year, we had 200 people present on the Teams platform to participate in that course. And that is, I think, a clear indicator that the need is very, very, very strong, and people are really interested in that topic. So what is the message I would like to give you from the experience of being in the process of preparing this petition to the rector of the university and being in the process of creating and coordinating the interdisciplinary course? So the message is, first of all, that students expect interdisciplinarity, because knowing about or learning about climate crisis from the major perspective is not enough. There is a very strong feeling that systemic approach is a must, and students want to take actions. Therefore, part of the course, we're taking part in group projects, practical ones. Some of them were local, some of them were national, and we even had one international project. And I would like to present a very, very short excerpt of what students left me after the course, because apart from, let's say, regular finding out what they think about the course, I was doing, of course, parallelly to that, I was doing a research and asking several people about climate crisis, how they feel about it, how they feel about the course, and so on and so forth. So 3 short excerpts from the young people with whom I work. First one, the climate crisis was the first thing that motivated me to go to protest. It is something that I worry about every day, something that is always at the back of my head. The main reason for my concern about the future, an important factor of reluctance to have a family. The climate crisis is affecting my whole life, and it is creating a sense of injustice. That person is 20 years old. Second excerpt. I thought I was a conscious, meaning responsible consumer and a person who cares about environment. And it was only these classes that made me realize how much I missed. And the third one, my biggest and most shocking discovery was the understanding that it is impossible to save the planet with the current ultra-capitalist approach. So these are messages from my students as far as the climate ecological crisis is concerned and how they feel about it. On top of that, I would like to emphasize that what is very important, the missing point in this entire puzzle is the emotions. So when you start to teach people about climate crisis, when you start to listen to them and discuss things thoroughly, the climate anxiety things comes into the being. And this is the very important issue when talking and doing all necessary actions connected with just transitions have to be taken into considerations. So one thing is petition about climate strategy. Another one, parallel one, is the interdisciplinary course. And what are the results, in a nutshell, of course, of this processes? Few months later, after delivering a petition, we asked our rector to meet with us again and actually asked him to fulfill one of the suggested propositions in the petition about climate strategy, which is establishing a climate council. And I'm very happy to announce that this climate council has been established, and the rector of the Jagiellonian University accepted all 21 people were suggested to be included in this council, people who have experience, knowledge, and also a majority of them are engaged activists in the field of climate ecological crisis. So in a nutshell, just to wrap up all things, I would like to emphasize that having this experience, I have wonderful opportunity to share with you only, the top of an iceberg of this experience, but in a nutshell, what are the conclusions? That first, university, of course, this is obvious, it is an institution in which you can learn about climate ecological crisis and also about practical solutions to them. However, point two is that universities is an organization that is becoming, that should become sustainable itself, and also resilient, and also adapted to climate change as much as possible and as fast as possible, with people who work at the university, with people who study at the university, and with institutions and organizations around him. And last but not least, and this is the most important conclusion, that really, again, it is a kind of a letter and a message from my student. What we should do, we should blur the line between activism and academia. And I love this one, and I would like to translate it into my language, because I would not understand it literally that everybody has to become an activist within academia. I think it's quite unrealistic. But what should be done and what is realistic is to make the climate ecological crisis the main theme of entire didactical research, practical outreach, all kind of activities that university is doing. And I think I will stop here. I can elaborate on that a little bit if you like later on. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer further questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Professor Jasikowska, thank you very much for this outstanding example of the actions undertaken by the Jagiellonian University, not just as an institution, but actually as a community of people who are engaged in mitigating the climate change. It surely proves that the academia is not just a place where we teach, when we create the knowledge, but actually we create the attitudes and engagement of young people. And with that, I would like to give voice to Professor Andreas Loschel from the Ruhr Universität Bochum, and ask you, Professor, in your research, you focus on economy, and economy is very practical field, but for some people it can be quite abstract. So from your perspective, what do you think how can we overcome the obstacles regarding the impact of just transition, and proving that there are some opportunities in this process?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and the possibility to talk here. And indeed, I would I would like to highlight as well some of the, I think, needs of science or needs that science has to take into account when tackling practical problems. So if you start my slides, I've prepared some slides for that, and you can just jump to the second slide if you want. I'm here as a practitioner, as an economist that works for many years now on the science policy interface. So if you want, you can start the slides. Okay. And in this policy interface, I have worked for many years in activities that try to support policymakers with scientific knowledge. And I think this interface between scientific knowledge and practice received much more attention in recent years. And there are many changes, major changes, that are reasons for these interest in this interface. For example, the greater accessibility of knowledge through the internet with reliable but as well unreliable and false information, some growing sense of a post-expert world, and the emergence of problems like climate change or the pandemic, which are complex, wicked problems that lead to scientific conclusions that are very often expressed as probabilities rather than certainties. So science is now far away from being definite. I still don't see my slide pack, so I don't know, probably you can start this, that would be good. We don't have it. Ah, okay, good. Excellent. I sent it yesterday. Okay, so let me go without slides. Okay, here we are facing a world now which in ideal is simple, because in an ideal world the gap between scientific evidence and policy is actually minimal. Now, in this very naive view, we have a scientific consensus on an objective and comprehensive account of the relevant evidence, and the policymaker, they are here a centralized small number of decision makers, and they are more or less following this scientific advice because that's in this naive world their source of knowledge, and they understand what the scientists say and implement these evidence-based scientific contributions. But of course, that's not how reality works. These processes are highly nonlinear and they are very indirect. So these links between scientific evidence, as I said, very often not definitive, but with probabilities and uncertainties, has to be translated into policy making, and all these expertise and evidence is what we might call socially embedded. So there are a large number of influential factors, and scientific evidence is one source of information and knowledge. It's an important source, but there are many more. And this is, of course, as well an inherent danger. So instead of what I just described as evidence-based policy making, we might end up with something that we might call policy-based evidence making, where policymakers are cherry-picking relevant knowledge that supports their own course and claim biased evidence for their own purposes. And that's, of course, an inherent danger. And actually, the IPCC is an example. And Jim Ski was just talking. I'm as well a lead author in IPCC, but Jim Ski is leading the whole exercise of the Sixth Assessment Report Working Group 3. And the IPCC is an attempt to find a common ground on sound science and to avoid this danger of politicizing science. And this means that scientists, they have to present their insights differently. They have to evaluate different future policy options, and they have to think about their practical consequences. They have to show trade-offs and overlaps but they should try to avoid direct advocacy for particular options, not being as a political actor, and they should as well try to not solve these trade-offs in advance, because trade-off solving, this is a job of the policy process, and includes, of course, as well the whole society in these endeavors. So explore options and disclose pros and cons. And I think that is the main role here, engaging in good policy making via committees or other things, and in these different forms of consensus building, and therefore the problems of the people, which are in the core of today's workshop, are so important, especially since we know from a political economy perspective, there are a lot of vested interests in these transformations, which are heard very often much more in these real political processes. So it's up to scientists to spell out exactly the implications of different political proposals. And I wanted to look at this with another example. And this example is indeed from the coal phase out and the just transition in the context of the coal phase out, because the second question we were asked to answer was how to connect science and society to find answers to the challenges of just transition. And I think it's good to look at a real example, like here the coal phase out. And as you know, this is a discussion that is also very visible in Germany, because we have made major progress on phasing out coal in Germany. And that is also discussed very often in the context of just transition, which is an old concept, as we heard, that goes back to the 1990s and was more used in the context of trade unions, support for social assistance programs of workers that were about to lose their jobs as a result, for example, of environmental policies. It was, let's say, re-emerging in the Paris Agreement, and of course as well in the Silesia Declaration in the 24th Conference of Parties in Katowice in Poland. And that whole concept of just transition actually asks for a broader notion of what is meant, and we've heard that as well from the other speakers, a broader notion on potential negative consequences of this energy transition, not only on the affected workers, but broader impacts on households, on consumers, on industry, on regional development, and in a broader perspective, consideration of societal impacts. And I think that is very important to keep in mind. Because here, what then just transition means is that we have specified roadmaps with consequences of coal plant retirement, with an assessment of the appropriate policy instruments in a way to include key stakeholders in the process. And we've just learned, it's important that just transition is a transition that can be anticipated and allows for broader adjustments. And this is the role then as well of economists that try to highlight what are the consequences of these transitions for different groups, and how are these policy instruments actually working, and how are they affecting the different parts of society. So we need a better understanding in detail of who will be affected by the transition, how these societal groups can be effectively addressed, and how these powerful vested interests can be counterbalanced. balanced. So we have to take into account, as I said, things like regional economic development and regional economic future. So I have a clear structure how we can bring forward these affected regions. But we have to as well think about, in a broader sense, what does it mean, for example, in terms of energy prices for consumer or industry? And we have to think about how this is spreading not only beyond the regions on the national level or beyond individual countries. So it's much more than just decent jobs. It's much more in a broader concept, and these are things that are difficult to assess, but very important. And in Germany, for example, what we try to do in order to connect science and society in the phase out was the setup of a coal phase out commission. So there are different forms of public deliberation, such as stakeholder dialogues or citizen assemblies or just transition commissions. We have just heard all these examples. The idea always is to reflect the public opinion and further agreement between these different interests. And I think these are very important fora that have to be strengthened. In the German case, we had a commission, and actually it was called the Commission for Growth, Structural Change and Regional Development. Publicly, it was very often just called the Coal Phase-Out or the Coal Commission. But as you can see from the title, the idea was much broader. The idea was to find a consensus-oriented dialogue between stakeholders and representatives of utilities, electricity users, trade unions, local communities, NGOs, academics, a few, and state and federal governments in order to find concrete transition plans, measures, and roadmaps. And as you might know, the recommendation was to phase out coal by 2038, if possible 2035. The new government just sworn in yesterday, now is going to target coal phase out for 2030, so even further. The German case, the German Coal Commission, is an example that here we try to achieve a lot of different objectives in these in the work of the commission. And in fact, the German commission was, I would say, less focused on achieving what you might call throughput legitimacy or regional inclusiveness, because the stakeholder commission had quite some lacks or shortcomings in terms of stakeholder engagement, transparency, and responsiveness. So there was a narrative of regional transition and structural change, okay, but it was much more encompassing in general and issue-driven. So this might as well the reason why in the end we ended up with relatively moderate targets in terms of achieving climate goals, relatively late phase out, and a lot of discussion about these financial support for specific reasons. There are other examples, like, for example, the Canadian Coal Phase-Out Commission, which was much more focused on collecting and reflecting the needs of communities in the coal regions and communicating these findings to the federal government. That's probably as well a good takeaway for similar endeavors that it's really important to engage on these local level much more than we have seen in the past, in order to increase legitimacy of these agreements, because for example in Germany this is still very heavily debated, and all the differences they have tried to solve them with financial support for regions, but that at least so far has not really shown a lot of success. So okay, so to wrap up the two questions, I think this is natural leading in the third question: is social dialogue the future of science? From what I just said, yes, it is. The answer is for me is relatively clear. Scientists in the past have mainly worked in policy processes, and it's clear that these policy processes involve social dialogue, and this will be much more important in the future as we are tightening up our climate policies, because with these really ambitious targets on renewable build out, on infrastructure build out, new electricity grids and so forth, we need engagement, and we need true ownership of societies in the energy transition. Otherwise, these drastic policies to respond to climate change will not be implementable. Thanks a lot.
Professor, thank you so much for your fruitful presentation, and also emphasizing the fact that, you know, scientists previously were engaged in the policy actions. These days they are broadly represented across the whole chain of creating the legislation, but also consultation and creating mechanisms for the just transition. And with this presentation, we come to an end of the first panel of the conference, Human Faces of Climate Change. I would like to thank all the participants. I would like to thank all the experts, Professor Konduri, Professor Jasikowska, Professor Ski, and Professor Loschel, for your presentations, and invite you for a short break. That will be 5 minutes break, after which we will start the second panel of the conference.
Over half of the world's population lives in cities. While each city is unique, they face similar challenges, including pollution, the climate crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The exchange of ideas to address urban challenges, such as improved housing, basic services, and green spaces, is critical. The World Urban Forum, known as WUF, is the largest global gathering on sustainable urbanization. The forum is convened by UN Habitat every 2 years. In 2022, WUF 11 will be the city of Katowice in Poland, with the theme Transforming Our Cities for a Better Urban Future. WUF 11 in 2022 will explore solutions to make cities safer, greener, and a better place to live. This is a transformation that Katowice itself has experienced. WUF 11 is organized by UN Habitat, Poland's Ministry of Development Funds and Regional Policy, and the city of Katowice. We are building the cities of the future today. Join us in 2022 and be at the heart of this change.
National Center for Climate Change is the first research center in Poland focused on a wide scope of climate change issues, operating within the Institute of Environmental Protection, National Research Institute. We provide expertise on climate policy, conduct climate change impact research and analytical works, deliver insights to decision makers in climate policy, support the Ministry of Climate and Environment as well. We focus on low and zero-emission transport, adaptation to climate change in cities, just transition, sustainable investments and green cities, circular economy, green finance, business responsibility, as well as education and building social awareness of climate change, both formal and informal. Important part of our work are conferences and webinars for various groups of recipients where we connect public institutions, business and academic work on both local and international level. Global E-Mobility Forum, People and Climate, Solidarity and Just Transition, Human Faces of Climate Change are the titles of the most famous examples of our annual global events. Every quarter, we publish a magazine with different leading topics: cities and climate, green finance, just transition. These are the titles of the latest editions. One of our projects is Eco-Funding Search Engine, a portal where one can find all the options for financial support and investments in ecological projects. Another one is already very popular publication, Climate Education Green Kindergarten, where teachers can find practical and ready-to-be-used interesting hints and ideas for lessons with children. We cooperate with other research institutions, international organizations, academia, public sector, NGOs and business, sharing knowledge and building the awareness of the coming change regarding the new professions as well. Climate change officer, climate resilience officer, many new job careers in the e-mobility sector, to name just a few. Please follow us on our social media.
This is Human Faces of Climate Change conference by the National Center for Climate Change. Welcome after the break. During the conference, we are discussing how to bring scientists and society together to find answers to challenges related to the just transition and climate change. We are looking for ideas to facilitate the social dialogue, but most importantly, how to change, how to translate theory into practice. In the second panel, we have our distinguished guests that will share their experiences and insights, and I would like to welcome Professor Bogdan Chojnicki from Faculty of Environmental Engineering and Mechanical Engineering, Poznań University of Life Sciences. We also hear from Mr. Henry Weissman, who is Senior Research Coordinator, Deep Decarbonization Pathway Projects, Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Ms. Magdalena Mariya Kajak, Manager of the Laudato Si Animation Program, Global Catholic Climate Movement, Laudato Si Movement Poland. The first person to take place in the panel is Professor Chojnicki. Welcome, Professor. It's a great pleasure to see you again in our discussion about the just transition. And without further ado, I would like to give you the floor.
Good afternoon, good morning. It's still morning. I just wanted to add just a little bit about the just transition in the context of the education. Yesterday, I was presenting some social surveys of our society, and we already can say that, yeah, people in Poland are scared of climate change, which is, from one perspective, okay, because the fear is just good at the beginning, but on the other hand, I would like to say that I think this expression of fear was really interesting to hear in Professor Jasikowska's presentation, because some of her students were expressing really the feeling that the world is ending. So it sounds very scary that the young society, young part of our society, expressing this type of perspective. But on the other hand, the climate change is a very serious issue, and I don't need to talk more about this. The conclusion from my yesterday's presentation was also that we are half sure that we want to leave a coal. I think this is the effect of a long time period of actually the paradigm of development in Poland that assumes that coal burning is the source of our development. I think we have such experience. So only 50% of population is pretty sure about the transition that based on the removing the coal and replacing this source of energy with renewable energy. I think this is a very great challenge in the context of social communication, how to explain it. The third conclusion after this survey is just simply we are just basis that we are just ready to work on the personal level, which means that people are very committed to do it. But the final analysis, what people think, they can do about the climate change, is a little bit surprising, because actually we are a little bit disoriented what to do. Which means, from my perspective, is that we, of course, this is the only element of the whole transition, but we need really education. Professor Jasikowska mentioned about the course that was showing different perspectives on climate change, the effects of climate change, the future of climate change, and of course, this is very necessary to increase the knowledge about it and how to find it. But actually, if we talk about the future, future activity, let's say in the range of our country, but I think the same situation is everywhere. During the changes, we just need to realize that we have two efforts. The first effort is climate change mitigation, which is related to simply to the physical properties changes of the atmosphere. This is a really big issue. And I'm afraid our society is still not very well aware of this situation. But the other element of the whole conversion or the whole transition is of course climate change adaptation. And we have of course the really need of the education at the all levels of the education process. This is not the only scientific community that is mainly located at the universities or institutes, but we need to develop education processes also in the basic and the secondary school level, because we should know more from the beginning what is really going on in the context of climate change. Of course, academic community can offer the education, and this education is the step of this education is just showing how the climate change is working from the perspectives of atmospheric physics, but finally what is the linkage between the climate change and the rest of activity, and of course the biosphere, which is very important, especially if we talk about the biodiversity. At our university, at our faculty of environmental engineering and engineering of mechanics, we just decided to start up the first level study, which is called Engineering of Climate Protection. Why the engineering of climate protection? We are talking a lot about the problems. We are talking about a lot about the issues. We are showing the aims that we is supposed to reach in a certain time period, but actually we have no specialists that are able to implement the whole activity. The knowledge about the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation actually is very spread over the different disciplines. And in many cases, especially if we contact to each other, we see that there is really big discrepancy in the knowledge. We really have no very common and global idea how to deal with this transition. And this engineering of climate change protection course, which is a first grade study, will be consisted of such things like water management in the city and water management in the rural locations. I think there are completely two different topics. Even at our community, we had a very big discussion how to deal with water management. Why it is split, but we know already that, for example, the climate mitigation in the cities are not it is only based on the energy change. But if we talk about the adaptation, I think this is absolutely important challenge. There is a little bit different situation in the rural area, and the methods and tools that are necessary to be applied in rural area. Of course, the agriculture and forestry role in climate change is really under the big debate. But again, simultaneously, we have no really experts that are able to integrate this knowledge and to apply in the landscape and in the city, in our economy. And finally, I just wanted to say that we also have during this course, we have also aiming the issue of biodiversity. It's really hard to communicate biodiversity because our work is based on the economics and utility as a way of understanding of anything. And biodiversity somehow we can say from a single person can be considered as useless. So there is no really knowledge about all system of the ecosystem services. I think the academic community can produce this type of courses. This is our activity at our university, Poznań University of Life Sciences. I think this is the answer for the transition, just transition, via simply education, the people who will be able to integrate our efforts in the context of climate change. I have a feeling that we still have a lack of this type of persons, and the persons who are going to feel that their career is going to follow this type of activity. This is the challenge for the next 30 years. So in many cases, I assume that the people who graduate this course this will be the basis for career. We must support our society in this transition by the education and the building up all other frameworks, economical frameworks, social frameworks, as a basis for just transition, but academic community can serve with education's efforts. Thank you.
Professor Rowiński, thank you very much for this perspective, and one more time emphasizing the role of the universities and academic community in on one hand, creating knowledge, educating young people about the climate change and creating the awareness of climate change. But what was here very strongly emphasized, also creating the career path, creating skilled workers that can, in the future, work in new sectors of a green economy. Thank you very much for your insights. And now I'd like to invite our second guest, who is Mr. Henry Weissman from the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. Mr. Weissman, from your experience, what are the best tools for involving society in just transition?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the question, and thanks for the invitation to participate to this event. It's a pleasure to share the panel with colleagues coming to the climate change question from very different perspectives, and I will come to that. But I think that this is critical to be able to address the challenges that we are facing. So I will try to approach your question from the angle of the question posed by national deep decarbonization, which means the approach of trying to understand what it takes to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, so mitigation at the country level, consistently with the climate mitigation objective of the Paris Agreement, but also in a way that achieves key socio-economic objectives as defined in each country. And here we'll build on the expertise, the experience that we have built over the year in the context of the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Initiative that I'm leading at IDRI, and in which we are working with in-country partners on this question of national deep decarbonization in more than 25 countries. So before going specifically to the question that are framing the conversation, just a quick stock take of what science says about this question, because I think it's important to understand how to approach it, because the magnitude of the challenge conditions the way we should approach it. So what science says about decarbonization? First, if we want to achieve the goal, we need basically to transform everything. We need to transform energy systems, we need to transform industrial systems, we need to transform transport systems, in building systems, land use and agriculture, etc. So everything. So it's a large challenge. And the way so the second message, the way this transformation can happen will vary from one country to the other. And it needs to capture the specificities of the national circumstances. So we need to renounce from the beginning at the idea that there would be any silver bullet that would solve the question in general, but rather approach this question of the drastic transformation that need to be implemented, taking into account the specificities of each context. The third message is that if we want to create the pathways for the deep change that we are talking about, we need to adopt a long-term vision. And this is notably because we need to capture path dependencies and inertias that help capture the consequences of what we do in the short term for the possibilities of change at the longer term horizon. And what we are doing now in the next few years, next decade, will condition to what extent we'll be able or not to achieve the deep decarbonization transition that is required by the climate objective. The fourth message is that even if it's extremely challenging, this is technically possible. And there are, I mean, many of the current technically available solutions are sufficient at least to initiate the transition if we deploy them at the scale that's required. And in parallel, we need to work on technical innovation, but there is no reason to think that there will be a barrier, blockage from a technical point of view. And this leads me to the fifth and final message, and I think which is maybe the most critical aspect in relation to the question the question that are framing this conversation today, is that, okay, if it's not technical, or if the main difficulties are not technical, understand me well, it doesn't mean it's easy. There are lots of challenges, but that's not what will be blocking. So what may be blocking the transition? And here I'd like to highlight 2 points. The core of the challenge is linked to, first, political economy aspects. In the context of this transition, there will be winners and losers, and there will be social impacts of the transition where people will be affected differently. This transition will not be the same for everyone. And so, in short, this is a story about people. This is a question of how people react and live with this transition. And the second core challenge is that if we want to address this question, we need to invent packages of policies and actions. And here, I mean, again, there is no silver bullet. There is not one single instrument that can solve the problem. Carbon pricing, it can be part of the solution, but we know very well that it's not with carbon pricing that we can solve the challenge at the scale that's required. We need instead to invent some combination of actions and policies that can articulate actions by a variety of actors. And here, that's because very fundamentally, this transition will require all actors to play their role in the transition. Each different actors, obviously the governments, but also the local institutions, the private sectors, the investors, the citizens, all actors in the society, they have different levers in their hands. And the question is whether we are able to activate these different levels in support of the collective transition. So that requires some articulation between different actors and different decision makers. And here again, this is a question of people. Who are these people who have these levers in hand, and how to make sure that they can activate them in support of the collective transformation? So altogether, what science says, just to summarize very briefly, it said that the main challenge is what we need to unlock is to align the expectations and to make sure that different people coming from different perspectives can play their role in a collective game that we need to play to achieve national deep decarbonization. So this leads me more specifically to the 3 questions that are framing the conversation here. The first one about how to translate theory into practice while providing scientific solutions to the problem of the people. So that's the first question. And just when thinking about it in the light of what I've said in introduction, I'd like to say that I don't believe that the decarbonization challenge is really a problem of translation, in the sense that this concept would suggest that the theory has some answers that would just need to be turned into practice. I don't think that's how this works. And I don't think that's how we may find the solutions. What science can provide is to explore some solutions instead of providing what could be the solution. The science will never say what is the solution, but it can highlight some of the solutions and should highlight what are the clear conditions, enablers, impacts attached to each of them. And the reason why it's very important that science, it's very well perceived what is the role of science, is that when it comes to decarbonization, there is not really a set of solutions that would be clearly better than the others. If that was the case, honestly, and if we had an agreement of that from a scientific perspective, I don't think it would be difficult to implement that. The reality is that we have different options, different possibilities, different strategies with different pros and cons. And the solutions, what will be concretely implemented, is fundamentally a matter of choice, a matter of social choices. And this choice can be made in different manners, but my personal conviction is that choices that would be guided by a social dialogue, by involving people in the process, even if, I mean, obviously it's clear, it's challenging. I mean, how to organize a conversation, and we'll come back to that with the second question, but this is the only way to ensure that there is sufficient ownership by the very people who will implement it. And it's the only way to make sure that those who will experience the transition, both the positive and the negative consequences, can be part of the process and not just takers of the solution. And it's the only way to establish efficient and accepted transitions. So making sure that science can provide the framing for a conversation, but that eventually this conversation should not be guided by the idea that science has some solution that should just be translated into reality. But science is here to help guide a social conversation in which there needs to be a kind of a social agreement as to what we are doing, acknowledging the consequences on the different actors and discussing collectively what is the combination of actions that could be done, for example, to manage the negative effect of this transition. Which leads me to the second question: how to connect science and society to find the answers to the challenges of just transition. And here, before getting into that, I'd like to make a side note on the just transition question and the link between just transition and climate change. And I want to say that there has been lots of progress on this question very recently, and it's now very clearly accepted and acknowledged by a diversity of actors that climate change and just transitions are not two separate topics. They are actually the two sides of the same coin. Notably, it's impossible to imagine that we could implement ambitious climate actions if it's not done in a way that addresses the challenges of just transition. So what we're talking about here, when we talk about finding a solution to the climate change issue, it's not to find a solution of climate change independent of just transition. It's to find a way to address climate change and just transition altogether. I just want to say that this is now explicitly acknowledged in the international climate regime. The recent COP26 decision has an article that, so Article 32, who, for those who want to go and check, that invites countries to develop long-term low-emission greenhouse gas emission development strategies, so the strategies that reduce emissions, towards just transitions to net zero emissions. And so this shows that there is officially now some integration between the just transition issue and the net zero emission target, which is the goal of the mitigation action that needs to be put in place. So we need to cover these two topics together in the social dialogue that I mentioned in response to the first question. And here the main challenge, and this is important, it's very important to acknowledge it, is that we need to build bridges between the different partners of these social dialogues. And we need to acknowledge that there is a real challenge in making sure that people coming from different perspectives, different entry points, different expertise, who are all very important in the conversation, can understand each other. This is a question of establishing a common dialogue, or at least a dictionary, so that people talking about the same topics, but with different languages, different expertise, can understand better each other, because it's the only way to organize the social dialogue. Having a dialogue, I mean, has as a precondition to make sure that people can talk to each other, can understand what the other is saying. And here in the climate and just transition conversation, at least from our experience, we see that in many cases, the core of the challenge is that people think they are talking about the same thing, but they don't, or at least they don't understand what the others are saying. So here we need to establish processes and methods that help bridge the different perspectives. That's notably the effort that we are doing in the context of the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Initiative, where notably we highlight that the dominance of modeling, so technical modeling, quantified modeling, which is really at the core of the climate change discussion and has guided most of the climate conversation until now, it should be revisited. And here, don't misunderstand me. I am a modeler as a background. I think models are very useful. They provide interesting insights, but they are not sufficient. Just because they are technical and quantitative angle to the discussion. And it's very clear that this does not allow an open conversation with full engagement of all non-technical experts. So it's critical that the modeling insights that can be provided to the social dialogue are complemented by a broader work on narratives that formulate the levels of changes and the socio-economic dimensions associated to them in a manner that's open and that allows a dialogue between people coming from these different perspectives. So here in terms of methods, that's the main point that we are seeing, is that we need to work with the two sides of the coin. So the quantitative side, which can provide a clear benchmark, a clear guidance, which is required for policymaking, but not limit the dialogue to that, because if we do that, we would not allow capturing all the aspects of the just transition discussion, which are critical for effective implementation. And that leads me to the last question: is social dialogue the future of science? And here I will make a very short answer. I think the answer is clearly no, it should not be the future of science. It should be the present of science. Ideally, it should have been the past, but I don't know how far we will manage to get. But here, it's extremely critical in this moment where the urgency of action on climate change and the urgency to find solutions on climate change that can be consistent with the just transition dialogue need to be found. We need to find a way. It's extremely important that scientists do not see themselves as being those developing solutions in their ivory tower and just communicating that to the social dialogue, hoping that then this can adopt the solution that would have been provided by them. Rather, it's critical that the scientists see themselves as having a role to facilitate, to help organize the social dialogue. And this leads to adopting new methods and a new perspective to science. So for me, this is really the key agenda that should be in the minds of all the actors of this discussion, and notably all the scientists working on climate change, which is that their role is just not to be outside of the social dialogue, but be an integral part of the social dialogue and engage with the social dialogue, not thinking that they would provide the solutions, but they should provide the information that is required for the society to find the solution that suits it. I will start there again. Thank you very much for having me in this meeting, and thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thank you so much for your presentation and very engaging answers to all the questions that were part of the other part of today's conference. What I take from your presentation is that scientists, they can provide frameworks, models, guidance for solutions, but actually not the ultimate solution. The role is to create bridges and dialogue and actually facilitate the whole process, evaluate possible solutions, explore solutions, and co-create with the society. And dialogue is not the future. Dialogue is the presence of the whole process. Thank you so much, Mr. Weissman. And now I'd like to invite our next guest speaker, Ms. Magdalena Mariya Kajak. Magdalena Mariya Kajak, she represents Laudato Si animation program. Hello. Ms. Kajak, we are actually talking a lot about the consequences and the aspects of the just transition. And sometimes we may have the impression that the economic consequences, the economic facts are taking the lead role in this discussion, talking about the impact of phasing out and going green. But actually, and this is what Mr. Weissman focused in his presentation, it is about people, because some people will be affected more than the others. And when we speak about the process, it is very important to include the aspect of values in the just transition. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's really a pleasure for me to be among such a special speakers, and beneficial to be able to listen to previous guest speakers. In my presentation, I would basically like to touch upon the three main themes that appear in the question of the panels. I will try to answer the questions about grassroots environmental initiatives, seeking a common language, and of course, spiritual leadership. I will start my presentation with the spiritual leadership because its role is crucial. We, as the Laudato Si movement, defines ecological conversion as the transformation of the hearts and minds to our greater love of God, each other, and creation. It's a process of acknowledging and our contribution to the social and ecological crisis and acting in a ways that nurture community healing and renewing our common home. Ecological conversion was first used in the Catholic Church by Saint John Paul II during his prophecy of the 7th of January 2001. And so Saint John Paul II noted that a man and woman were made in the image of God and were told by God, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth, we read in the Genesis. But he pointed out that the relation is not absolute, but it's ministerial. He highlighted how humanity has disappointed God's expectation by devastating plants and valleys and polluting water and air. We must therefore encourage and support the ecological conversion, which in recent decades has made humanity more sensitive to the catastrophe to which it has been heading, Saint John Paul II. Furthermore, he highlighted the goals of such a conversion, including returning to the right relationship between humans, God and the world, and living by them. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis echoes Saint John Paul II. His Holiness identifies our current ecological crisis as summons to profound eternal conversion. What everyone needs, he writes, is an ecological conversion whereby the effects of the encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. In the book, The 10 Green Commandments of Laudato Si, Father Josh Tromkuritadam, head of the Vatican Ecological and Creation Office, writes that an ecological conversion calls for a return to the Creator, a turning to God in a humble and genuine spirit of repentance, acknowledging God as the Creator and the source of all things, and repairing the broken relationship with God and each other. Father Kuritadam also writes that an ecological conversion calls for a turning to the creation itself as a caring and responsible stewards. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis shares the attitudes and changes within ourselves that can result from undergoing an ecological conversion. First is gratitude, recognition that the world is God's loving gift, generosity in self-sacrifice and good works, a loving awareness of universal communion with the rest of creation, greater creativity and enthusiasm in resolving the world's problems, and a feeling of responsibility based on faith. We recognize that conversion is a grace of the Holy Spirit that is not fully dependent on our own actions, but we know, however, that we can open ourselves to be available to receive the grace for prayer and commitment and enter a way of life that is no more aligned with the gospel values. And its most basic level, an ecological conversion involves 4 steps. First is, of course, recognizing that we have harmed creation. We must examine our lives and acknowledge the ways in which we have harmed God's creation through our actions and our failure to act. Grassroots community can do it by reading scientific reports such as Living Planet report, IPCC reports on climate change, checking our own carbon footprint, conducting an energy audit, reviewing our consumption habits, looking for food, water, and energy waste. Second thing is repentance and turning to the Creator. It's not true that our irresponsible use of creation begins precisely where God is marginalized or even denied. If the relation between human creatures and the creature is forgotten, matter is reduced to a selfish possession, man becomes the last word, and the purpose of human existence is reduced to a scramble for the maximum number of possession possible, said Pope Benedict XVI. Third thing is commitment to change and becoming good stewards of creation. An ecological conversion must translate into concrete ways of thinking and acting that are more respectful of creation. The fourth one is community conversion. Ecological conversion takes place at the personal level, but as Pope Francis notes, a community conversion is equally important. Social problems must be addressed by community networks and not simply by the sum of individual good deeds. The ecological conversion needs to bring about lasting change in also community conversion. We have many examples of grassroots environmental initiatives as a global movement of Laudato Si animators, which brings together commitment Catholics to care for our common home. In Poland, we also run our own program, Green Parishes, which aims to green our parishes both as a building and as a community. By this program, we want to send a strong signal to the world of our real commitment. That is why the Green Parishes program involves concrete actions in the educational, practical, and spiritual spheres to raise awareness of the ecological crisis, to implement solutions that translate into reduced energy consumption, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, improved air quality or optimized water management, and to develop the sensitivity rooted in the church's faith and teaching to care for our world. In order to carry our just transition process well, we need to look for a common language, to create a meeting place for people from different backgrounds, who through different perspectives will be able to work together for our common good. We need dialogue between scientists, decision makers, intellectuals, politicians, and social workers, ministers, economists, activists, and analysts, to respond together to the ecological, economic, and spiritual challenges of our time. We should organize more roundtable discussions. An example of such a conference was the one we have been organizing with Pontifical University of John Paul II in Krakow every year since 2018. The aim of the conference is to set an example of roundtable discussion. The human species is beginning to recognize that it's scarcely responsible for life on a planetary scale. We have entered to Anthropocene, the era of man acting as a geological force. At the same time, we see that man does not control the process he unleashes. He does not control the technology that is turning the walls of our homes into transparent screens. He does not control the financial capital detached from the earth and human labor. It is increasingly confronted with the consequences of climate crisis, wars over resources, forced migration of millions of people, and non-natural disasters. Many point, I believe, in the unique vocation of the human species and as the main culprit of the ecological crisis, and call for the melding of man into the web of nature of technology. Many others deny human influence on the climate crisis, shifting the blame to natural process. Many finally challenge the belief that humans could make a difference at this stage to avoid catastrophe. As Professor John Milbank said at the first Creatio Continua conference, since man has dragged the whole earth into a climate crisis, it is a man who must pull us out of it. We are all convinced that it is with God's help necessary and possible. When we talk about human faces of climate change, I must mention about meeting of the experts in mental health and the climate crisis that we have this month. They share knowledge and real statistic of what's happening, especially among children and youth. Statistics were shocking. More than half of young people believe they will not have access to the same possibilities that their parents had. They think that the things that are most available to them will be destroyed, and they believe that humanity is at risk. They added 8 of 10 young people think that people who have power have failed, while around 30% of young people are hesitant to have children for these reasons. A faith-based response for those involved in the climate crisis would be two words: solidarity and spirituality. Talking about solidarity has always been a way of putting love into action, putting values into life, and feeling that we are moving together in creating the kind of world we all want. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Magdalena Kajak, for your presentation, your insights. Solidarity and spirituality are those 2 words that you recommend as an answer to what's going on, all the processes, and also the anxiety that many of us can feel in the process of transitioning and making the transition just. And with this presentation, I would like to thank you, the experts and panelists in the second panel of the conference, Human Faces of Climate Change. Thank you so much, Professor Bogdan Chojnicki, Mr. Henry Weissman, and Ms. Magdalena Mariya Kajak for your insights and inputs to the discussion. And I would like to invite you now for a 5 minutes break, after which we will go into the final phase of the conference.
Over half of the world's population lives in cities. While each city is unique, they face similar challenges, including pollution, the climate crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The exchange of ideas to address urban challenges, such as improved housing, basic services, and green spaces, is critical. The World Urban Forum, known as WUF, is the largest global gathering on sustainable urbanization. The forum is convened by UN Habitat every 2 years. In 2022, WUF 11 will be the city of Katowice in Poland with the theme Transforming Our Cities for a Better Urban Future. WUF 11 in 2022 will explore solutions to make cities safer, greener, and a better place to live. This is a transformation that Katowice itself has experienced. WUF 11 is organised by UN Habitat, Poland's Ministry of Development Funds and Regional Policy, and the city of Katowice. We are building the cities of the future today. Join us in 2022 and be at the heart of this change.
National Center for Climate Change is the first research center in Poland focused on a wide scope of climate change issues, operating within the Institute of Environmental Protection National Research Institute. We provide expertise on climate policy, conduct climate change impact research and analytical works, deliver insights to decision makers in climate policy, support the Ministry of Climate and Environment as well. We focus on low and zero emission transport, adaptation to climate change in cities, just transition, sustainable investments and green cities, circular economy, green finance, business responsibility, as well as education and building social awareness of climate change, both formal and informal. Important part of our work are conferences and webinars for various groups of recipients, where we connect public institutions, business and academic work on both local and international level. Global E-Mobility Forum, People and Climate, Solidarity and Just Transition, Human Faces of Climate Change are the titles of the most famous examples of our annual global events. Every quarter, we publish a magazine with different leading topics: cities and climate, green finance, just transition. These are the titles of the latest editions. One of our projects is Eco-Funding Search Engine, a portal where one can find all the options for financial support and investments in ecological project. Another one is already very popular publication, Climate Education Green Kindergarten, where teachers can find practical and ready-to-be-used interesting hints and ideas for lessons with children. We cooperate with other research institutions, international organizations, academia, public sector, NGOs and business, sharing knowledge and building the awareness of the coming change regarding the new professions as well. Climate change officer, climate resilience officer, many new job careers in the e-mobility sector, to name just a few. Please follow us on our social media.
This is Human Faces of Climate Change conference. Welcome. And now we are starting the final part of the conference, during which we are discussing ways to connect science and society in order to create more effective, engaging, and just solutions in the process of transformation. And now I'd like to invite you to listen to the voice of Reverend Lauren Van Ham, Climate Action Coordinator from the United Religions Initiative. She's one of the panelists and speakers in this final panel. We'll also have Mr. Danielle Villetti, Senior Director from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And last but not least, we will host during the conference Mr. Mirosław Proppe, Chairman of the Board, WWF Poland. So firstly, I would like to invite you to listen to Reverend Holland Van Ham. She represents United Religions Initiative, and her voice will firmly give an input towards discussion about involving different communities and religious and indigenous groups in the dialogue about the transition.
Hello, my name is Lauren Van Ham, and I serve as the Climate Action Coordinator for the United Religions Initiative, or URI. URI is an organization comprised of interfaith cooperation circles around the world. Cooperation circles range from 7 to 200 members who join together across 3 or more religious beliefs, spiritual expressions, or indigenous traditions to conduct grassroots efforts that improve their lives and communities. This sort of cooperation relies on sacred teachings, science, and indigenous traditional knowledge. When combined, just transitions become possible every single day. At URI, these are happening mostly at a local or regional level. Very often, some translation and personal connection is what is needed when suggesting unfamiliar scientific solutions to meet the needs of people. In India, for example, clean water and sanitation is a big concern. One of the cooperation circles there, the WASH Alliance, has found ways to provide both scientific education and community support to assist those living in remote areas in protecting their water sources and constructing toilets. The best way to implement these changes is through hands-on experience and person-to-person conversation. Worldwide, there is a great deal of work to do, and the challenges of just transition are large. For example, some of the cooperation circles in Western India and in Mozambique are working hard to defend their riverbanks and shoreline due to sand that is in demand to create solar panels. Even though science points to solar energy implementation as necessary for us to attain our net zero emissions goals, there is a lot of care and communication that will be required in order to respect land, resources, and the lives of all species calling these spaces their home. The UN's Sustainable Development Goals do a comprehensive job of illustrating the benchmarks for both science and social needs combined if we are going to successfully cap and even begin to sequester the carbon currently threatening life for future generations. But science and people must work together and find points of commonality and compromise, which is why the guiding principles for a just transition are so imperative. Reflecting on the challenges of just transition and thinking about a number of URI cooperation circles, I am struck by the initial obstacle of change. Humans don't much care for it. Even when data or charts indicate that the change will bring benefit, it can be met with a lot of resistance and grief. 2 examples. Last year in Tanzania, there was an effort to introduce the practice of cooking with biogas. A large biodigester was built, and by feeding it biomass and food waste, it produced both liquid fertilizer for the gardens and biogas for cooking. A biodigester eliminates the need for cutting trees to be used for firewood, as well as the need for cooking over flame. Using biogas to replace wood is so good on so many levels that with deeper analysis, it meets nearly every one of the 17 of the UN's SDGs. However, there was great concern in the area that food cooked using biogas would not taste as good as the food cooked with fire. As a community building exercise, the people did an experiment and offered a blind taste test of food cooked using both methods. The biogas won, and this form of science is now at work, protecting and restoring Earth in many measurable ways. Second example, in Malawi, there is a massive tree planting effort underway. It encourages smallholder farmers to plant native fruit-bearing trees, and the community is working with conservationists, farmers, youth groups, and others to plant more than 20,000 trees over the next several years. This effort would be financially impossible in this region, but for a group of funders and technicians who are helping to document the project by geotagging each tree. These trees will be adopted and paid for by people around the world who wish to support reforestation efforts. The challenge is this: how to convince the smallholder farms that this agroforestry will be worth the effort. Malawi is presently experiencing record heat. The seedlings are severely stressed, and if the trees even make it, they will not produce food or the revenue connected to the food for several years. Wouldn't it be simpler to plant vegetables and carry out a minimal existence that way? Well, the science and traditional knowledge, as we know, tells a different story. With more trees in the area, there will be less erosion of invaluable soil, there will be natural shade and windbreaks, the pollinators will return to support other plants, there will be fruit and greater food security, and the economic well-being of villages will increase if they can manage to keep the tree seedlings alive. In order for just transition to work, the need for on-the-ground education and hands-on support is truly great. There are some very encouraging examples of science, society, and faith working together to influence decisions for communities, institutions, and entire regions. In the United States, wildfires have ravaged huge sections of the state of California. Last year, firefighting officials at the state level began working with indigenous groups who have for hundreds of years used control burning practices to tend and care for the land. Previously, there was little to no communication between indigenous nations and forestry workers, but now some plans are in place that create greater job security and better land tenure. Another very inspiring example this year has been a cooperative training effort between UNEP's Faith for Earth initiative and URI. Together, we have created projects in India, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Lebanon. In these locations, we have been inviting stakeholder engagement with education and training days. Every training day includes information on the science of climate chaos and the biodiversity loss that is at stake, as well as sacred teachings that represent the religious beliefs of those in attendance. Appreciating the science and spiritual teachings, the trainees are then encouraged to design and implement plans in their own communities to address one of three areas: pollution and waste reduction, water conservation, or more broadly, climate action. In India to date, more than 20 grassroots projects have evolved from this training, and they are already generating greater commitments to waste reduction, as well as impressive work in regenerative agriculture and food security. The success of these projects has very much been about bringing different perspectives together. No one arrives with expertise in every area, but over the course of the training, everyone leaves with a greater appreciation of skill sets that had previously felt intimidating, unfamiliar, or just unimportant. It is absolutely true that systems begin to change as our individual hearts and minds begin to change. However, it is also true that for a transition to be just, everyone must participate in the change. I would like to share a quote that perhaps many of us have heard before. It is from Gus Speth, an American environmental lawyer and advocate who co-founded the Natural Resource Defense Council. A number of years ago, Gus Speth said, "I used to think that environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that." Whether or not we are able to reduce greenhouse emissions to the extent required in the next 5 years, nearly everything as we have known it is going to change. To survive it in a good way, in a peaceful way, in a loving and just way, requires each one of us to change. We must listen and begin to appreciate the multiple perspectives of science, faith, and what is needed for everyone to have a pass at a sustainable, healthy existence. It won't be easy, but it could be wonderfully creative and rewarding. It is my intention to remain curious and courageous, and I hope that you will all join me as we work toward a healthy recovery and a just transition for beings everywhere. Thank you, and I am wishing you much goodness as a result of today's conference.
Thank you so much, Reverend Lauren Van Ham, for emphasizing the fact that to make the transition effective, we actually need to start from intellectual and spiritual transitioning of the values and beliefs that we have, but also emphasizing great examples proving that science can be a leading force in convincing people who are very often resistant to change that using some solutions can make their life not only more effective, but it can also be aligned and integrated with respect with traditions, cultures, and religious and spiritual actions. Thank you so much for this voice in our discussion. And now I'd like to invite to the table Mr. Danielle Villetti, who is a Senior Director at United Nations Framework for Climate Change. Senior Villetti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to speak on behalf of the NCCC Secretariat to this very important conference. And the topic we are discussing today, it's really critical in looking at the transformation that we want and the future ahead of us. So just transition is really increasingly and acceptably seen as one of the enabling strategies for revising climate action. And climate ambition in our process is not only about numbers, but it's more importantly about people and their transition in a sustainable manner, offering them decent and quality jobs and economic growth. There are 3.3 billion workers in the world, and many are already suffering from the impacts of the climate crisis, whether it's due to heat stress, drought, flooding, storm, or otherwise. But on the other hand, we also know that mitigation action, such as transition out of fossil fuel-based sector, will also impact the 3.3 billion strong workforce. So it's a delicate transition. It must be a just transition. It can only be realized by having cooperation between science and society. It should be issues for governments, of course, but society and businesses as well. Government, business leaders, and society must work together to help provide the policies and programs to facilitate such a transition. And while it's clear that the governments have the responsibility to provide the policies and the broad framework for a just transition, including integration of skills, development plans, social protection, labor policies, and mechanisms to fund this transition. At the same time, science and business have their bits to inform and implement these actions. Business to engage in social dialogue with the impacted community to plan the just transition is absolutely critical. And society has to engage in providing all necessary inputs in policy planning and also to plan and execute the transition with minimum adverse impacts on the lives of people. In fact, if we look at the labor market, the fastest growing jobs in several economies are those related to solar, wind, and geothermal energy and related businesses. But we cannot realize or reap all these benefits unless the transition policies are planned adequately. Experts are required to be engaged in policy planning processes using latest tools and methodologies. Policy planning should be informed with the latest science by undertaking ex-ante and ex-post assessments of impacts of policy on people and businesses. Good news is that parties to the Convention and the Paris Agreement are making progress on this matter at the national level, of course, and also under our UN climate change intergovernmental process. So if you allow me to say a few words on what has happened at COP26 in Glasgow, which just concluded, parties and providers implementing their pledges should be ensured that a just transition is promoting sustainable development and eradication of poverty and creating decent work and quality jobs. So parties in this decision further mention that this will require financial flow consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development, deployment and transport technology, and provision of support for those in need. In addition, with respect to having just transition to promote sustainable development and put just transition to practice, our parties have also provided specific recommendations through the Forum and its Katowice Committee on Impacts to bring just transition in practice. Let me say a few points on this. And this recommendation, parties are encouraged to engage relevant stakeholders at each step of the process of designing and implementing planning mitigation policies and policies to achieve sustainable development, including through social dialogue when possible and, of course, subject to national circumstances. The relevant stakeholders in this decision identified, among others, workers, employers, organizations, academia, public and private sector, unions, and civil society. So the COP encouraged parties to explore complementary policies, such as economic policy, social protection, and labor policies, to help strengthen the outcomes of the implementation of these mitigation strategy plans, policy and programs, including, of course, national determined contribution and low emission development strategies are our big plans to contribute to the achievement of the goals of the Paris. And further, it's also worth mentioning earlier, strengthening international and regional cooperation, as this contributes toward planning and implementing mitigation policies with social and environmental benefits. For example, to facilitate technology development and transfer. So, furthermore, the Katowice Committee on Impacts also prepared specific work on the assessment and analysis of the impacts of the implementation of response measures to facilitate the undertaking of economic diversification and transformation and just transition before our outcome. So this whole technical work really aims in supporting countries in planning just transition policies that are well informed and understanding the impact of these policies. So while we're looking at the revised and updated national plans, the national determined contribution or NCCC, it's clear that more parties have considered social and economic consequences of mitigation measure and of just transition. So this type of conversation are really critical and timely. We need to really look how to translate this into concrete actions involving all the sectors and all the actors. And I'm really glad to see that this is a multi-cultural discussion coming from many different fields and many different points of view. So as we see that countries have already recognized an equal impact of policies of different groups of society and all the workforce, and sort of plans to address such impacts by including the concept of just transition there overall in this implementation, including through just transition mechanisms. So by also having laws and strategies for protecting workers and social mechanisms for job creation, skill development, and employment policies, and all this done in consultation across the various actors. So additionally, and to conclude on a good note, I feel are also planning to give special attention to addressing the impact of vulnerable groups and communities in relation to poverty, job opportunities, and inequality during the transition. So it's a process. It's a process. It's taking time, but it's important that it's well done and that everybody is there and go together along this line. And then we are at the beginning of this, and we can see that even if we are at the beginning of this, the importance is dramatically growing as we move forward. And the years ahead are very critical, as we know, as we move to the next COP27 in Egypt and then COP28, where there will be the first global stock take, where we can look at where we are in our path to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I am confident that all these aspects related to this social dialogue and the opportunities for a just transition will be further highlighted and discussed. So I can stop here and, of course, happy to discuss along with you. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to discussing. Thanks.
Director Villetti, thank you very much for your insightful voice in the discussion and emphasizing the importance of social dialogue, bringing all the actors and stakeholders to the discussion, both on the governmental and local level, bringing communities and those who are directly impacted by the transition. Thank you so much. And now, last but not least, presentation and voice from our guest speaker, who is Mr. Mirosław Proppe, Chairman of the Board of WWF Poland. Welcome to the conference. It's great to have you with us. Yesterday, we had another voice from WWF Poland, sharing experiences in facilitating the mayor's activism and activities. And today we would like to hear about your perspective in bringing science and society together and working for the best solutions in just transition process.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to this conference. It's a pleasure and honor to be hosted here and to have a voice. And thank you that we could share our experience yesterday and also our perspective today. Yes, so first of all, how to bring the science and the scientific knowledge to the society. I think the first thing is not even so much in talking, but really in discussion with the society. And talking is sometimes, like speaking ex cathedra, giving a lecture, but not necessarily this message that we are conveying is accepted by the audience. So really engaging discussion is a key issue. That's why we are running this forum of mayors, and that's why we are very much engaging and proposing to all the parties to discuss and really to have a deeper discussion. But the discussion to be really successful need to be managed, needs to be facilitated. And I think this is a little bit a deficit in our country, that we are not using the professional facilitators for many of the discussions and meetings. Sometimes it's just 2 sides or 3 sides who are meeting, and each of them have their own arguments and their own emotions and fears and solutions and agenda, which is natural. But then without the facilitator, it is very hard to really get to the real issues, to open them up, to discuss them in details, and then to find a solution and next steps. So really, facilitated discussion is something that is very crucial, especially during the transition time, because in the transitions, what we need to do is, of course, use the science for new solutions and so on, but especially on the way from today to the new state, to the desired state, it's an emotional process, and those emotions need to be managed. And they can be managed in the discussion when the discussion is facilitated. So the first key is the facilitator, and then the second key for the successful transformation of the science to the society is also the way how the facilitator is getting the group. So the group is diverse. It's not only the one group where only one emotion or one point of view can be heard, but also that many different groups may hear different points of view and different opinions. And then it's a feeling about the common sharing of some issues and challenges and common working on the solutions. So the solution is really then developed and worked out by the group and much easier adopted by the wider group. We had a couple of examples how it works in Poland, and the very good example is the development of the just transition plans in Eastern Wielkopolska or in Lower Silesia, especially, where exactly this model was adopted. There was a moderator, someone who was not emotionally involved in the issue, but was moderating the discussion with the flow leading to working out the practical solutions for those regions. So really that we could see that it has helped. It also was on the national level, and when I had an opportunity to discuss it with the Ministry of Climate, we jointly agreed that it is much better to involve the parties and to moderate the discussion. And anyway, we will finish with what we think at the beginning, what are the directions of the just transition, but it will be worked out in the common process with the participation of many stakeholders, and then it will be easier to implement this. The need of this facilitated discussion is also reflected at the plan to create the National Agency for the Just Transition, and we are very happy that this idea is embedded there. And the second point I wanted to raise is that it's also important if we have some intermediaries, people who are conveying the message, the scientific message, sometimes crafted in a language that is too scientific for general audience, and presenting those ideas and those information in a language of benefits of a given group. So when speaking to the miners, or when speaking to the construction sector, or when speaking to the agriculture sector, and so on, we need those intermediaries who are trusted by those groups, and then using those trusted intermediaries to convey the message. It's very hard to get the trust, especially when you ask someone to start the transition, to move from today to the new unknown state. It's, as I was saying, very emotional process. That's why those trusted intermediaries are very, very much needed. And this is called, again, from the scientific point of view, this is called the multi-level perspective theory of change, and transformation, but this is exactly what is needed, because then it is much easier to get the involvement of people. But there are two crucial elements for selecting the intermediaries. You need to know exactly what is the goal. What do you want to achieve from this discussion? Is it giving the knowledge, raising the awareness of the problem? Or is it working out the solutions? Because then you need different intermediaries, different personalities or organizations to do it. Some are much better in communicating and explaining, and some are much better in working out and developing solutions. So depending on the goal, you need to select those intermediaries. And the second is how much really this intermediary is really trusted with the group that you want to speak to and work with. Sometimes, or maybe quite often, this is done that the central level government sends his messenger, whoever he or she is, or an institution, but this messenger is already labeled to be the government representative, or whatever is perceived. And this might be a blocker of a good communication and good intermediarship. So this is also very important to find really someone who is trusted with the group. So goal, and then a trusted advisor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights and emphasizing the importance of facilitated discussions and trustworthy intermediaries who are able to convey message to a target group that is showing benefits of the just transition. Thank you so much for all the insights and practical case studies that were presented by all the experts, panelists of today's conference. We are very grateful for your participation and input in the conference. I would like to share with you the key insights, key messages that were highlighted today by our experts and our guests, so that there are some lessons that we can take from this conference. First of all, I would like to quote Professor James Key, who said, "In just transition, practice has preceded theory. So theory needs to catch up now, help understand and further shape practice. This dynamic is very useful in evidence-based planning. Unplanned transitions tend to be unjust." Further, we've heard from Professor Faba Konduri, and she said, "Financing, policy making, and involving stakeholders are important, but just transition is made possible by the technological advancements and increasingly cost-effective availability of new technologies. It is very important to communicate to stakeholders and help them acquire skills to use those technologies." We also heard from Mr. Danielle Villetti, and he said, "It is clear that awareness of the social and cultural impact of just transition policies is increasing. Discussing this is critical because the social acceptance for transition is the key for its success." We've heard from Mr. Mirosław Proppe. We have to keep in mind that social dialogue has to be properly facilitated. The parties need assistance in coming to an agreement. And last comment and last message we'd like to share with you is from Mr. Henry Weissman, who said, "What is implemented is a matter of choice, a choice that has to involve social dialogue and social engagement to ensure proper ownership of choices so that society accepts the responsibility for the process." With regards to whatever social dialogue is the future of science, the answer is simple. It should already be the present. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for spending this day with us and for being here and learning from our experts. On behalf of the organizer, the National Center for Climate Change, I would like to thank the honorary patrons of today's conference, the Ministry of Climate and Environment of the Republic of Poland, European Commissioner for Innovation, Research, Culture, Education and Youth, Mariya Gabriel, and Vice President of the Polish Academy of Science, Professor Paweł Rowiński. Thank you so much for your involvement in creating this incredible event. We do believe that all the voices that we've heard from our guests will serve us an inspiration, as guidance for further actions to lead the just transition process involving different parties, not leaving anyone behind the process, making the process just, inclusive, and effective. With this, I would like to thank you so much for being here. It was an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with you. And I do believe and hope we're going to meet soon discussing the just transition processes. Thank you so much.